I'm going to start pinning my lining to my jacket with right sides together, focusing on the collar first. You'll notice that I've gone back in and just to help clarify, I I drew my stitching line in so that I have a nice sharp corner on my collar, nice sharp corner on my collar. I also did it on my lapel pieces down here, you can see. What we're going to do is I'm going to pin this together, but I'm going to stitch the collar portion first. And I am going to stitch from, there's my large circle. It's where we stitched the collar to the jacket, both on the facing and on the jacket. And I'm going to start without stitching over any stitching that's right there. I will stitch from the large circle to my corner to the center, back stitch and stop, and then I'll stitch from the other side. Same thing. What this is doing is making sure that I'm not pushing any excess fabric into these notch areas, because the notch areas are the place where it gets a little tricky as we pin. The other thing I'm going to do before I start pinning is I am going to pin a little thing that's called a tailor's blister. And I'm pinning it on the upper collar, and I will also eventually be pinning it on the lapel. And what that is pinning, taking just a little pinch far enough back away from your stitching, and you're pinching maybe about a 1/4 inch up, so it's a 1/2 inch total. And what that does is by pinching that tiny little bit in, I should pin it this way, pointing towards my corner. What that does is it's going to ensure that my undercollar helps my overcollar roll under. I know it seems kind of strange, but it's a smart thing to do, and you'll see why once you've stitched. So before I even start pinning, I'm going to pin, and I'm just pinning through my upper collar. I'm going to pin a little tiny pinch out, and then I can go back and I can start pinning my upper collar to my under collar, making sure that I start down here. I have to push the seam allowance out of the way, but I want to make sure that I'm right at the large circle. I'm going to go up and make sure that I am pinning my raw edges together. Now, what you may find when you start pinning, sometimes what I like to do is pin, you can't see me, sorry, I pin from either side. And again, I want to push the seam allowance out of the way at these large circles, because I don't want to stitch into the seam allowance at all. So you've noticed I've pinned each end first. And then what I will do is pin across the top, raw edges together. Once I pin this in place, I want to make sure that everything's pinned, everything's lined up as I need it to be. And then I'm going to go over and I'm going to sew before I even come back and pin the rest of it. So I've taken my little tailor's blisters, little pinch out, 1/4 inch fold, so it's a 1/2 inch total. And then I have pinned the rest of my collars together, and I'll be back after I sew. I finished stitching my collar, and remember I stitched from the large circle right at the notch towards the point. A 1/2 inch away from the point, I reduced my stitch length. Then I did a diagonal stitch, 1 or 2 stitches across the point. That's going to help us have a sharper point when we turn. And I stitched them with my reduced stitches for another 1/2 inch. and then I return to my regular stitch length to the center of my collar, which is center of my collar. Then I did the same thing from the other side. I started at the circle with my regular stitch length, about a half an inch away from the corner, reduced the stitch length, did a diagonal stitch, reduced stitch length, and then stitched the regular stitch length until I met up with my stitches from before. Then I took my pins out, which I've already done, and now I'm going to stitch the front, the lapel, and down the front of my jacket. We're going to do the same thing here. I marked my stitching lines once again because I'm going to stitch under here. I'm going to stitch from my large circle, which is back here, with all my seam allowances pressed up out of the way. And I'm going to stitch, reduce my stitch length when I get towards the corner, about a half an inch away from the corner. Do 2 diagonal stitches, reduce stitch length for another half inch, and then regular stitch length the rest of the way down the front of my jacket. And I'm going to stitch all the way down to, let me get down here to the bottom. I'm going to stitch all the way down to here. I've got a stitch line. Remember, we're not stitched to the lining at this point, but I do have a stitch line 5/8 of an inch in from my seam, my cut edge, and that's where I'm going to stop and back stitch. We don't want to stitch any further than that. You want to leave that seam allowance loose. So I'm going to do that next. And again, I'm going to stitch directionally. So I'm going to start at the large circle, go to my corner and down the front. And then on the other side, I'll do the same thing. I'm going to start at the large circle, go to the corner, and all the way down. And I will be back when I show you, to show you that after it's stitched.